We're all good? All right, so last time we talked about market power, and I said it's a little bit of an interlude before we got more consistently into the material that's more macro-based. And so that's what we're going to do today, but I still need to finish up that one little topic from market power. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to talk about price discrimination. And generally, that's a characteristic that you'll only see when you have some degree of market power. It doesn't necessarily have to be monopoly. It could be in oligopoly, or it could even be in monopolistic competition. But you can't have perfect competition at price discrimination. Then we're going to talk about the big three of macro. And when people talk about, how is the economy doing? What is macroeconomics about? It's very useful just to say, oh, macroeconomics, that's about boom, 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 and you can talk about what those measures are. And then the final thing that we're going to talk about is one of those three measures of macroeconomic performance, which is inflation. And we'll talk about how we measure inflation and just some different terminology associated with understanding inflation. All right, any other questions before we get started? All good? All right. So, starting off, price discrimination. Price discrimination, again, it's one of these things where it could be an area for policy intervention. It's something that people get somewhat upset about when they hear about it. Sounds like a bad thing. I'll talk a little bit about the policy implications in just a second. But basically, all price discrimination is charging different consumers different amounts or different prices that are not justified by cost differences. So discriminating, just differences, right? So different prices, you're charging one set of consumers a different price, then you're charging another set of consumers, and it's not justified somehow by cost differences. So, what are some examples of this? Car lots. So what happens in car lots? So you walk out to buy a 2016 Toyota 4Runner, right? What's going to happen? Are you going to get the same price that I'm going to get?
Probably not.
Yeah.
Maybe. It depends on the dealership, but most likely probably not.
Probably not, right? And in that situation, it's almost like an old Middle Eastern bazaar situation where the consumer walks in with certain information, the dealer has certain information, they're trying to read about how much the consumer is willing to pay, and they kind of do this like two-sided bargaining situation to where they get to an individual price. Same thing happens in the job market too. I mean, the weird thing is so we hired 4 people this year. Every single one of them could potentially come in with a different wage, even if it was like the same position. Like it ends up being 2 political scientists and 2 economists. But if it was like 4 economists, you could hire 4 economists. All of them have the same PhD, but because it's an individual bargaining situation, and maybe I as a employer am reading different things from one than another as far as like how low can I get them to come and offer them and still get them to come. Right. I didn't do that because I think it just makes my management problems harder later on if I have faculty members with very different salaries. But at the same time, you could think about the same thing. So that would be a situation where that's what we refer to often as perfect price discrimination, where each individual pays a different amount. Right. You also have the situation where instead of having each individual pay a different amount, it's just based upon some group characteristics. So this is what we often refer to as third-degree price discrimination, where it's just like, you have a characteristic, and I'm not going to charge you any more than someone else with your same characteristics, but I'm going to charge you a different amount than someone with other characteristics. So how does that sometimes happen? Do you guys ever get discounts in certain places that other people can't get, that I couldn't get? Student discounts, right? Student discounts are third-degree price discrimination, right? So basically, because you're a student, they recognize that you might have a different willingness to pay than I do as a non-student. And because you think, well, students, they have lower, access to income generally. Therefore, if we charge them a lower price, I can get more students to buy my services, and I don't have to lower my price to people that I know earn more money that on average will be non-students. So that's one way that you can discriminate. Offer student discounts, senior discounts, same sort of thing. What about gender differences? Is it ever the case that women pay less than men?
Well, yeah, of course, especially at the clubs.
At the clubs, right? It's ladies' night, right? So.
Yeah, that was the first thing I thought. Like usually $20 for men, $5 for girls.
Yeah.
Major discount.
Now, that's not justified by cost differences, but it is justified by by profitability differences, right? It's more profitable to not have it just nothing but guys in a place. So for them, there's a certain gender balance that you would want to have.
Let me ask you this. How come we don't get discounts on things like tampons and pads? We didn't choose to be a girl, so, So, how come there's not, necessary discounts like that?
Well, again, it's because the only guys that are going to be buying tampons and pads are guys that are buying them for girls anyway.
Yeah, so.
Right? So it's one market, right? It's all women. That's actually the ultimate consumers of those goods.
Consumers, okay.
Yeah.
It'd probably have to be a subsidy for that.
Right, it'd have to be a subsidy instead of charge.
Yeah. That makes sense. Okay.
But we can think about very specific goods, and actually a faculty member brought this example up the other day, and there's a little bit of controversy about this. How about, I know you guys are students, you don't get a lot of your clothes dry cleaned, but do women pay different prices than men at dry cleaners?
Yeah, because their clothes are more expensive.
Why are your clothes more expensive?
Because they're fancier, and they're prettier.
Right, so a women's blouse versus my shirt will cost more to dry clean the women's blouse than it will mine.
Right.
Now, on average, that's because there's assumption of more delicate materials.
But it also has to do because women are more attached to their clothes. If a blouse gets ruined, I'm gonna raise hell about it, but you might not. You might just be screw it,
Exactly, and I think that's part of it too, right? Okay. So part of it is the delicate of materials, and that's what one of my colleagues would say, oh no, you're talking about silks and you're talking about buttons that are very careful, and I think part of it too is that so our former secretary, she was we both go to the same dry cleaners. And she's like, well, doesn't it take you forever to drop off dry cleaning? I'm like, no, I just have it all in the bag and I drop it off and I leave. And she's like, oh, no, I make them individually count the items and inventory them. I'm like, oh, well, yeah. They lose something of mine. It's just another shirt, No big deal. But for her, it's a big deal. Every individual item matters. Oh,
yeah,
it's just another white shirt. It's just... I don't want them to lose it, but I'm not going to spend the extra time to sit there and watch them count it and give me a receipt on 5
I
boxes.
hate it whenever I lose a shirt in my closet and I cannot find it.
Yeah. That one's not as wrinkled. That's my criteria, right? That one. So it could be somewhat by cost differences in that case, where you're talking about the materials different, or just the headache cost of dealing with female customers or something like that, which a lot of people wouldn't justify. That's kind of discriminatory. Right, just because you think, certain people are a pain. That's why do teenagers get followed around stores, where people presume that they're thieves all the time? It's my character didn't change when I went from being an 18-year-old wanting to buy something in Dillard's to a 25-year-old wanting to buy something in Dillard's, but people treated me differently. So anyway, cost differences or price differences, they're not justified by cost differences. Now, the cool thing about this is that you sometimes get this case. And I call this cool because I just think it's very smart, known as dynamic pricing. And it's charging different prices as external conditions change. But again, not associated with cost differences. So this is the case. My favorite example of this is something that Coca-Cola bottling company. So Coca-Cola, the Coca-Cola company is the one who makes the drink, and then the bottling company is separate Coca-Cola Enterprises is a separate entity that deals with bottling and such. They were beta testing some different kinds of Coke machines. And the one that they had, one of the things that they're testing was one that charges higher prices as the ambient temperature rises. Right? So we think of it like a Coke machine in the building, that's not a big deal, right? You don't have it's interior, it's not going to change that much during the summer. But a lot of Coke machines are places like baseball fields or, external at a park or something like that. And so if it gets hotter, what's going to happen to the demand for soft drinks? It's going to increase. People's willingness to pay is going to increase, and so you're going to charge them more during the hotter times, charge them less during the cooler times. What do you guys think about that?
Smart.
I think it's smart. A lot of people, though, got really pissed off about it. And so they had to retract it and say, well, no, we weren't really doing this. This was just, some crazy developer, just, this one marketing guy had this idea. But they could do it. They could totally do it. And the thing is that people think is like when you get charged different prices, it's, they're going to charge me more when I want it more. But it's also that, they're going to charge certain consumers less, and you're also just as likely to benefit from the lower prices than the higher prices. It's like when people talk about how Canadians pay less for prescriptions, right, than we do, right? For the same drugs, they pay less, right? And people are always like, this is, they should have to charge the same price, it's unfair, blah, blah, blah. If we made pharmaceutical companies charge the same price, would they charge the higher price to everybody or the lower price to everybody?
Higher.
The higher, right? If you make one price, you're not going to get people to charge the lower price to everybody because they're just going to raise the price on the Canadians rather than lowering the price on the Americans, right? So likewise, if you could have dynamic pricing at Coke machines, you're more likely to see some deep discounts when it's actually kind of cold outside. And it is going to rise when it's warmer, but it's not going to be, if the price rises when it's warmer, what's also less likely to happen? What happens a lot of times if you go out to like a soccer field or a baseball field and try to use the Coke machines? I used to have this problem all the time.
The lines are going to fill up or they're going to run out.
They're going to run out, right? So they run out all the time because demand is variable based upon temperature and other characteristics. And if they could somehow control their inventory without having to send more people out to refill the machines, then it actually might make more people happier by having slightly higher prices. Because of course the people that are willing to pay more would still get the drinks. All of those are forms of price discrimination. Now, in terms of efficiency, and this is like even beyond NICO 202 issue, this is more like a micro theory sort of thing. The interesting thing about this is that how monopolies are inefficient because they're charging too much, and technically they're selling too little. They're not selling the right amount. If you actually allow for price discrimination, then they're more likely to sell closer to the efficient level of output. So price discrimination actually allows for a more efficient solution, even though people in their initial reaction might think, oh, I'm getting charged more, or I'm being charged more based upon my willingness to pay, and may get upset about it. But actually, from an economist's perspective, it's actually more efficient usually to have some degree of price discrimination, and you're more likely to get them to produce more. All right, so that's price discrimination. Now let's talk about the big three of macro. So if someone just wanted to ask you, okay, you're in an econ class. Just realized I wrote that above the line for the camera. Now it's good. Okay, the big three of macro. Someone says, how is the economy doing, right? So you're studying economics, everyone thinks you're studying the economy. How's the economy doing? If you can answer them with three characteristics of the economy, three metrics, three measures of how macroeconomic performance, then you'll basically be able to summarize what's going on in the economy. So what's the first one that we're going to talk about today?
GDP.
So inflation, GDP growth are two of them.
Recession, maybe?
So recession is going to be tied to both GDP growth and this other one that we're going to talk about. What's the last one? It's the other part of this chapter that we're in now. Chapter is entitled two things, blank and inflation.
Depression?
Nope.
Oh no, I'm thinking history.
Unemployment.
Unemployment, yeah. So unemployment's our last one. So unemployment and inflation is what we're going to be talking about in this chapter. We talked a little bit about GDP growth already when we talked about world poverty and talked about, just the size of gross national income, gross domestic product growing. This basically has to do with the size of the economy. We'll talk about it again in chapter 15. But for chapter 14, we're going to focus on these two. Now, the reason why it's useful to focus on these two at any point in time is that historically, there's been seen a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, which is that in general, we want inflation, which is a rise in the level of prices, to be relatively low or high. Which one do we want? Low inflation or high inflation? Low inflation. So we want inflation to be low, and unemployment, do we want that to be low or high?
Probably low.
Low as well, right? So the problem is historically, policies that cause low inflation often cause high unemployment. Policies that cause low unemployment can cause high inflation. So there's this fundamental trade-off that people talk about between inflation and unemployment, which is known as the Phillips curve. Some people, say it broke apart in the 1960s. It never really existed. There's a debate in macroeconomics, as there often is in macroeconomics. A lot more debates in macro than there are in micro. But there's a trade-off that people say between inflation and unemployment, not unlike the trade-off between equity and efficiency that we have in economics. So we want to talk about these two, first of all, because there is this kind of relationship between them. So inflation. We'll focus on this one first. Definition of inflation is just a general rise in the level of prices. So what inflation is about is it's about an average. It's not about a particular good. So you can't necessarily, regardless of how important the good is, you can't say, okay, Junior Food Mart, gas has increased by 20 cents a gallon in the past month. There's inflation, right? That's one good. Now, because that good is an input into a lot of other goods, there may be some inflation that's ultimately going to be tied to that, but you can't look at a single good and say that's inflation, right? It's about an average rise. And if on average other prices are decreasing, even though gas is increasing, then there's not inflation, right? So inflation is about the general price level. Two other terms to recognize, and they're important to distinguish between one another. One is deflation, which is a decrease in the level of prices. So inflation, prices are going up. Deflation, prices are going down. Between these two, because generally we have some degree of inflation, it's also important to occasionally talk about disinflation, which is a slowing of the increase in the price level. So you're still having prices that are increasing, but the rate of increase of those prices has slowed down. So prices are still going up, but they're just not going up as rapidly as they were before. So disinflation is a slowing of the increase in the price level. So an example would be, let's say we had 8% inflation this year, but if we had 4% inflation next year, do we still have inflation? Yeah, prices are still going up, but they're going up at a slower rate. They're not going up as quickly as they were this year, and so that'd be a description of disinflation. Deflation would be prices are going up 8% this year. Next year, they end up going down by 2%. That's actually deflation. Things are actually getting cheaper. Difference between disinflation and deflation. Here, the inflation rate is still positive. Here, the inflation rate actually becomes negative. Right? We'll talk a little bit about the inflation rate next. So how do we actually go about measuring this? Well, not surprisingly, and I forgot I actually made a handout. I'll link to this document on Blackboard, though. Every month, the Bureau of Labor Statistics so known as the BLS, goes around and has a household survey. And they take the survey about 400 plus items. Now, they ask individuals, but then they also go to retail establishments to try to like connect these things. So it's 400 plus items, which is they refer to as a basket of goods that consumers end up buying, and the average prices of those goods becomes what's known as the consumer price index. It's an index number. In other words, it doesn't have any actual, it's not denominated by anything. It's not a dollar amount. It's nothing like that. It's an index number that shows the average level of prices. That consumers pay. So the consumer price index, it's an index number, so it doesn't have any inherent value. It's only a reference point to a previous value. Based upon this 400 item basket of goods, and they figure out what the cost of that basket of goods is month after month after month in lots of different markets, and based upon how much that basket of goods costs, they create an index number that they can refer to how much it cost previously, et cetera, et cetera. In macro, you can go into more details about actually how you calculate, in principles of macro, you go into how you actually calculate the consumer price index. But right now, I forget the exact number, but I think it may be something like about 283, 284, something like that. And what that refers to is that back in 1982-84, which is when we've set our index value, that the prices in 1982 to 84 on average was 100. And we use that as our benchmark, and then every month after that, we're able to recalculate this, this index in relationship to how much that basket of goods cost in 1982. So every now and then we used to update that year, but we basically kept the 82-84 as the 100 benchmark because we haven't actually had that much inflation since 1982. I think, right now things cost 3 times as much as they did 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. It's not that bad, right? It's not like, you have countries like Brazil right now that are seeing like 10% inflation a month, right? So, in Brazil, things are going to cost twice as much next year as they did this year. So this is the measure that we have. So the way we actually calculate this inflation rate then the inflation rate is just calculated using the percent change formula. Is CPI, let's say in 2016, minus the CPI in 2015, and all of that divided by the CPI in 2015 times 100%. It's just the percent change in that index value. New minus old divided by old times 100%. That's what our inflation rate is. So if prices increase, then 2016 is going to be greater than 2015 CPI, so this is going to be a positive number, so you're going to get a positive inflation rate. If prices decrease, on average, if that basket of goods costs less, then the CPI 2016 is going to be less than the CPI 2015. That's going to be a negative number, and that is going to give you a deflation. So let's say, for example, in 2016, the inflation rate is, or the CPI is, 290. It was, let's say it's 277.1 in 2015. That ends up giving about 2.9 277.1, and so that ends up being approximately 0.009, or a little bit less than 1%. So you take new minus old, divide by old, and that gives you, in this case, a decimal, which we can convert to a percent. So, is 1% inflation big or small? It's pretty small, right? The Federal Reserve, which is in charge of mostly watching our inflation rate and making sure that it's not too big, they targeted an inflation rate around 2%. So the idea is to keep inflation in a fairly tight band between 2–2.5% or so. And if it's around there, then they're happy. So 1% inflation rate, which is what we actually saw, or is actually 0.9 percentage points inflation rate, is what we saw for the time going from March 2016 back to March 2015. And so for the last year, we've only had about 1% inflation rate. For this reason, and a lot of that, I think about half of that inflation actually happened between February and March. And so between January and January 2015 to 2016, we had basically no inflation. And so those cost of living adjustments that we talked about with Social Security, how if you have a government check that's coming in regularly, they'll give you more money to reflect the increase in the cost of living. There's no cost of living adjustment in 2016, right? Because inflation was so low. Now, let's talk about some issues with inflation. Why is inflation a problem? Right now, it's not. And we really have to go a little bit back in our economic history to talk about the last time inflation was a fairly large problem. If anything, people have talked about deflation being more of a potential problem since the Great Recession than anything else, worrying about a general collapse in the level of prices. But if you think about inflation, there's a reason why people are worried about it. One of the big things is that it involves a redistribution of wealth. And it's not one that people plan for. It's not one that policymakers would prescribe. It's not a planned redistribution of wealth. It's just a redistribution of wealth. So if I'm taking out a loan, right, and I'm paying 3% on that loan, right, taking a 3% loan, and all of a sudden there's 10% inflation, what is my actual interest rate on that 3% loan? So let's think about it this way. If I borrow $100, right, I have to pay back $103 next year. Okay, so that's the way the loan works. So I borrow $100 today, and then I have to pay back $103 next year. What could I do with that $100, among other things?
Invest it.
I could invest it, right? Let's say I invest in something that is perfectly resellable, right? That the market's not going to change that much, that there's not going to be price changes in that market. Let's say it's something like I don't know. I'm just going to make it up that 1973 Gran Torinos don't lose their value. So let's say you take that $100 and you invest it in a classic car, right? If all prices change by 10% the following year, right? That's what inflation means, a general rise in the level of price. And all prices are now 10% higher. How much am I going to be able to sell that $100 asset of a Gran Torino or a $10,000 asset or whatever for the following year?
110.
I'm going to be able to sell it for 110. I only have to pay back 103. So I just made money, and it redistributed wealth towards me from taking out a loan. That's not how loans are supposed to work. You're not supposed to make money off of taking out loans by just holding your money solid in one particular asset for a year and letting the prices change, right? And who ends up losing money? Well, whoever loaned me money is going to get $103, but now that $103 is worth a lot less than it was the year before, and so they're getting screwed. So we've redistributed wealth from savers to borrowers when there's unexpected inflation, right? So that's one problem that happens. The second thing is that cash holders lose money. So the way we've described this, it sounds like it's better to be poor, right? It's because poor people are more likely to be borrowers. But think about it this way. Who holds more of their total assets in cash? Poor people or rich people?
Poor people.
Poor people. Think Warren Buffett holds a lot of credit cards? I mean, he probably just has lines of credit at every bank that he'd ever want to go to, and owns half the things that he'd want to buy stuff from, right? So he's not going to he's not going to be pulling out a wad of hundreds when he wants to go somewhere, because guess what? Hundreds don't make any money, right, when they're sitting in your wallet, right? They're not doing anything for you. Poor people hold a lot of their assets in liquid assets, and they're going to lose out, right? If you're just holding nominally denominated assets, those are going to lose out with this. The other thing, and especially the case for hyperinflation, is that you get a waste of resources when people are either trying to avoid inflation or make money off of it. And this happens whenever there's some sort of speculation going on in the market, right? Where you get their talents and their energies aren't going towards the productive things that they've been trained for, that they've been working at, or anything else. And instead, they just want to try to take advantage of whatever weird thing's going on in the financial market, right? I talked to my other class about this. I'm listening to this biography of Hamilton. And, there's this whole thing that when the first Bank of the United States happened, all of these people wanted to subscribe to its loans, basically, hold its stock. And when they did so, they were speculating in it, and they stopped, these were merchants, and they'd shut down their stores so they could go, buy stock and sell it and just kind of be involved in, the early stages of day trading back in the day, right? And people would go, and they'd be like, I want to buy some, some bolts for my carriage or something like that. And they're like, oh, no, sorry, that guy's closed because he's off speculating in the market, right? Whenever you get some sort of hyperinflation, people spend a lot of time and effort trying to work that system, and it's very, very wasteful, right? If you think about hyperinflation and how people, when you try to hold their assets in a way that they're going to lose the least amount of value and everything else, it's just a very big waste of resources. So all these reasons, inflation's a problem. Now, these are reasons why you can say, based upon purchasing power alone, inflation's a problem. But I think psychologically, inflation is also a problem. And let me give you an example of this. Now, people don't really think of inflation being a problem right now because there just hasn't been that much. We haven't had that experience. But let me give you two examples. And talk about how you feel about this. Okay, so remember, inflation is that everything changes by the same amount. Right? First example is that you get a 4% raise, and there's 2% inflation that year. Right. So let's say you're earning $10,000 a year. You end up earning $10,000 $400. You get a $400 a year raise, but that $10,000 $400 is now worth 2% less because of inflation, buys 2% less stuff because of the increase in the overall level of prices. So your overall real wage is about 2%, right? So 4% raise, but there's 2% inflation during that year that eats away at the increased purchasing power of your raise. Another scenario, you get a 12% raise, and there's 10% inflation. So you're told you're going to make 12% more than you did the year before. You go from $10,000 to $12,000, But then by the end of the year, that $12,000 has lost 10% of its value, and it's only worth, I'm not going to do my math really quickly here. I guess that's worth, 10,800. I'm not sure if I'm doing that right. No, it's only worth, no, it's only worth 10,200 again. Yeah. So you get 10% inflation and you get a 12% raise. Which one do you like better? Which one would you rather have?
They're both the same.
They're both the same, but psychologically, which one do you think people causes more pain? Which one do people like better? But no, this is a bundle. This is A. You have two options. You have A versus and B, right? These things are bundled together. 4% raise and 2% inflation, or 12% raise and 10% inflation?
Probably
A, right? The weird thing about the way people psychologically process this stuff is that this feels like you've earned it. People are always like, I've earned a raise. This is what is owed to me, and this is what's taken away from you, right? This is how much inflation robs you of your wealth. And so if you earn 12%, like I'm worth a lot more, but something took away most of what I've earned as a ratio. And so they actually have this thing called a robbery index, which is just the inflation rate over the nominal wage increase, and whatever that ratio being, the higher that ratio is, the more people feel like they've been robbed. So in this case, you've only been robbed 50% of your raise, but in this case, you've been robbed, a sixth of your raise, almost 20%. And so it feels a lot worse. The inflation stings a bit more because you're seeing, wait a second, now I have to pay even more at the gas pump, now I have to pay more for bread, everything else. So that's one of the reasons why people really dislike inflation. Now, I'm going to claim, and we'll talk more about this on Tuesday, that unemployment of the three main macroeconomic measures, unemployment's the most important one. And I think it's actually tied the closest to actual well-being. When people are unemployed, when they don't feel like they have a purpose in life, it actually psychologically impacts them a lot more than inflation does, or just understanding that the economy's not growing as much, we're not producing as much. It's kind of an amorphous concept for most people. But if you have more people that are out of work for a while, it's negatively going to affect them then, and that unemployment, especially prolonged unemployment, has a really negative effect for the rest of their lives. So there's a really big negative impact from unemployment. The last thing that I'm going to mention about this is that also we need to pay attention to this term hyperinflation. And basically, this is when inflation gets out of control and spirals upward. The problem with the value of money often is that it's just based upon expectations. And so if someone thinks that the money that they're holding is going to be worth less tomorrow than it is today, are you going to be willing to hold it? No. No, and if you're trying to get rid of that money, then what's going to happen to other people's expectations about that value? They're going to think if you're not willing to keep something, then it obviously isn't very valuable, and the expectation builds in that it's going to be worth less the next day, and the cycle just gets faster and faster and faster. Now, this is often tied to bad government policy, where the government is actually, and we'll talk about this more with the monetary policy, they're just running the printing press too much. In other words, they're making too much credit available, which is diluting the value of the dollars that exist out there. Right, a number of years ago, Zimbabwe was in this spiral of hyperinflation because they made some really bad economic decisions. And they would get into the habit of just like adding zeros or lopping off zeros from their currency every so often. Like all of a sudden you have a 10,000, Zimbabwean dollar, and then the next day it's like, oh, we're trading the old Zimbabwean dollar, 10,000 of those is worth 10 of these today. Because they're running out of space on the bills basically because everything's becoming of so little value. And it's because they just keep on printing money and making credit more and more available. Usually it's bad government policy, but once you expect inflation, then it can often spiral out of control. And likewise, once you expect deflation, once the expectation is that it's going to stop, and the government is very solid saying, look, we're not going to tolerate this anymore. We don't care how bad the unemployment has to get. We're going to stop inflation. Then people are like, oh, okay. And then they hold on to it, and sure enough, inflation can be wiped away immediately. So expectations about government policy really play into hyperinflation and stopping hyperinflation. So that's all I got. We'll talk about unemployment next time.